What you're about to hear was never supposed to go live, and once it did, everything changed. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, not because of raised voices or dramatic accusations, but because two strong perspectives quietly refuse to bend in front of a national audience. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On this particular morning, The View opens the way it usually does, with light chatter, polite laughter, and a sense that the show is easing its audience into the day. Tom Cruise is seated at the table as a guest, invited to talk about his latest film project and a long career that has kept him in the public eye for decades. The tone at first is familiar and comfortable. Cruise speaks confidently but calmly, smiling as he answers questions about filming schedules, stunt work, and the physical preparation that has become something of a trademark for him over the years. The hosts respond with nods and brief follow-up questions, and the audience reacts with applause at appropriate moments, exactly as expected. Whoopi Goldberg, seated at her usual position, listens attentively. She allows the early part of the conversation to flow, occasionally adding a brief comment or a knowing smile when Cruise references industry pressures or the changing nature of Hollywood. Nothing in these first minutes suggests that the discussion will move beyond a standard promotional interview. The pacing is relaxed, the camera cuts are smooth, and the energy in the room is steady. The shift begins subtly, almost without warning. One of the co-hosts asks Cruise about responsibility in Hollywood, specifically the influence major stars have on audiences when it comes to lifestyle choices, public messaging, and personal beliefs. Cruise answers in a measured way, emphasizing personal discipline, focus, and accountability. He talks about setting an example through work ethic rather than through public statements, making it clear that he prefers actions over commentary. His response is calm, but it also signals a firm line he is not eager to cross. Whoopi responds by reframing the question, pointing out that audiences don't always separate the performer from the message. She mentions how viewers often interpret silence as a statement in itself, especially when it comes from someone with Cruise's level of visibility. Her tone is not confrontational, but it is direct. She leans slightly forward, hands resting on the table, eyes fixed on Cruise as she speaks. The studio grows quieter, and the audience applause fades more quickly than before. Cruise listens without interrupting. When he responds, he does so deliberately, choosing his words carefully. He explains that he believes conversations about values are deeply personal and that televised discussions can oversimplify issues that deserve nuance. He stresses that he respects differing opinions, but prefers to keep certain topics private, particularly when they risk becoming sound bites rather than thoughtful dialogue. His posture remains composed, shoulders relaxed, voice steady. Whoopi counters by pointing out that daytime television thrives on discussion, not declarations. She notes that the show exists precisely to unpack complicated topics in real time, even if they don't reach neat conclusions. Her tone remains measured, but there is a noticeable firmness now. She gestures lightly with her hand, emphasizing that viewers tune in because they want to hear how public figures think, not just what they promote. At this point, the energy at the table changes. The co-hosts glance briefly between Whoopi and Cruise, sensing the tension but not stepping in. The camera lingers a moment longer on their faces, capturing subtle shifts in expression. Cruise nods as Whoopi speaks, acknowledging her point, but when he responds, it's clear he isn't retreating. He says that engaging in every public expectation can lead to performative honesty rather than genuine conversation. He insists that holding boundaries is not avoidance, but a form of respect for the audience. The audience reacts with a low murmur, a mix of agreement and uncertainty. A few scattered claps ripple through the studio, quickly settling back into silence. The exchange remains civil, but the contrast in viewpoints is now unmistakable. Whoopi presses slightly further, asking whether public figures can truly separate their work from their influence. She frames it as a shared responsibility, not an accusation, but the question hangs in the air longer than usual. Cruise pauses before answering. It's a brief moment, but in live television, it feels significant. He then explains that influence is not something he claims or controls, and that attempting to manage public interpretation can become a distraction from the work itself. He emphasizes that his role is to tell stories on screen, not to guide public opinion off it. His voice remains calm, but his words are firm, signaling that this is a position he has considered carefully over time. Whoopi listens, then responds by acknowledging his perspective while making it clear she doesn't entirely agree. She notes that whether or not someone seeks influence, it exists, and avoiding that reality doesn't make it disappear. Her delivery is steady, without sarcasm or raised volume, but there is a clear sense of challenge in her phrasing. She leans back slightly, folding her hands, maintaining eye contact. The tension at this stage is not explosive, but it is palpable. The conversation has shifted from friendly exchange to principled disagreement. One of the co-hosts attempts to lighten the moment with a brief interjection, referencing the balance between privacy and publicity in modern media. The comment earns a small laugh from the audience, easing the room just enough to keep the discussion moving without derailing it. Cruz responds to the interjection politely, then circles back to his main point, reinforcing that he believes audiences are capable of independent thought and don't require guidance from actors. His tone remains respectful, but his refusal to concede ground is evident. Whoopi nods slowly, acknowledging his stance, but her expression suggests that the conversation is far from resolved. As the segment continues, the pacing tightens. The hosts are more deliberate with their questions, and Cruz's answers are more precise. The studio audience remains attentive, reacting less frequently, but more thoughtfully. There is no shouting, no dramatic gestures, just a clear, sustained difference in perspective playing out live. By the end of this portion of the discussion, it's clear that neither Whoopi nor Cruz intends to fully persuade the other. What has unfolded instead is a calm but unmistakable standoff, grounded in mutual respect, but defined by contrasting views on public responsibility. The segment has moved beyond promotion into something more reflective, setting the stage for a deeper exchange as the show continues. As the conversation moves forward, the show settles into a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. The initial tension hasn't disappeared, but it has stabilized into something more controlled, the kind of exchange that feels distinctly familiar to regular viewers of daytime talk television. Everyone at the table seems aware that the discussion has crossed into more serious territory, and there's an unspoken agreement to handle it carefully without pulling away from it. One of the co-hosts gently redirects the discussion by asking Tom Cruise how he navigates interviews when he knows certain topics might come up, especially on shows known for open debate. Cruise responds thoughtfully, explaining that preparation for him isn't about rehearsing answers, but about being clear on where he stands. He says that clarity helps him stay calm, even when questions challenge his views. His voice remains even, and his body language stays composed, hands resting lightly on the table as he speaks. Whoopi listens closely, occasionally nodding, but when Cruz finishes, she adds context from the show's perspective. She explains that the view is designed to explore disagreement without forcing resolution. Her tone is explanatory rather than confrontational, and she reminds viewers that differing opinions at the table aren't meant to corner guests, but to reflect the range of thoughts present in the audience watching at home. The way she speaks feels almost instructional, as if she's briefly pulling back the curtain on how the show operates. Cruz acknowledges this with a small smile, saying he understands the format and respects it. However, he also reiterates that respect works both ways, including respect for a guest's choice not to expand on certain issues. He clarifies that holding a boundary doesn't mean dismissing the importance of the topic, but rather recognizing when a televised setting might not be the best place for meaningful exploration. His emphasis is calm, but his words are carefully structured, suggesting he wants to be clearly understood. The audience responds with light applause, not loud or sustained, but noticeable. It suggests that some viewers appreciate the measured tone and the emphasis on mutual respect. The co-hosts glance toward Whoopi, gauging whether she wants to push further or pivot. She pauses briefly, then responds by agreeing that not every issue can be fully unpacked on live television. Still, she adds that raising questions publicly can encourage viewers to think more deeply on their own, even if the conversation itself remains incomplete. Her response subtly reframes the disagreement. Rather than focusing on whether Cruz should speak more openly, she shifts toward the value of initiating dialogue. Cruz listens, then responds that he supports dialogue, but prefers it to emerge organically rather than through expectation. He mentions that when discussions feel obligatory, they risk becoming less honest. His delivery remains consistent, calm, and unhurried. At this point, another co-host brings in a viewer-centric angle, asking how audiences should interpret silence from public figures. Cruz answers that he believes silence can sometimes be more respectful than oversimplified statements. He explains that audiences are diverse, and a single public comment can be interpreted in countless ways, often detached from its original intent. His reasoning is methodical, and he speaks as if he's explaining a long-held philosophy rather than reacting defensively. Whoopi responds by noting that silence, intentional or not, often gets filled by speculation. She says this not as an accusation, but as an observation drawn from years of working in media. Her tone remains steady, and her posture relaxed, but her words carry weight. She emphasizes that once someone reaches a certain level of fame, public curiosity becomes unavoidable, and managing that reality is part of the job. The exchange remains polite, but the difference in outlook becomes more pronounced. Cruz nods, acknowledging her experience, then states that he doesn't believe management should always equal engagement. He suggests that sometimes allowing space for interpretation is healthier than attempting to steer narratives. His voice remains level, but his phrasing signals conviction. The studio audience reacts with a mix of murmurs and brief applause. The camera cuts to different hosts as they absorb the exchange, their expressions neutral but attentive. No one interrupts, allowing the moment to breathe. This restraint gives the conversation a sense of authenticity, as if viewers are witnessing a genuine exchange rather than a produced segment. Whoopi leans slightly forward again, asking Cruz whether he ever worries that his approach might be misunderstood. It's a softer question, framed with curiosity rather than challenge. Cruz answers honestly, saying that misunderstanding is always possible, but he's comfortable with that risk. He explains that trying to control perception can be exhausting and ultimately unproductive. His calm delivery suggests this is not a new concern for him, but one he has long accepted. As he speaks, the tone at the table subtly shifts again. The earlier tension gives way to a more reflective atmosphere. The disagreement remains, but it's now layered with mutual acknowledgement. Whoopi listens carefully, then responds that while she still believes in speaking up, she respects his consistency. She notes that consistency, even when controversial, earns a certain kind of credibility. The audience reacts positively to this moment, offering a slightly stronger round of applause. It feels like a recognition of the respectful way the disagreement is being handled rather than an endorsement of one viewpoint over the other. The co-hosts appear more relaxed now, sensing that the conversation has found a stable footing. One co-host attempts to connect the discussion back to Cruz's career, asking how his philosophy has influenced his long-term success. Cruz responds that staying grounded in his values has helped him navigate both praise and criticism. He explains that not reacting impulsively has allowed him to focus on his work rather than external noise. His tone remains conversational, almost reflective. Whoopi adds that longevity in any public-facing career often comes down to knowing when to speak and when to listen. She frames this as common ground, a point where their perspectives overlap. Cruz agrees, nodding and briefly smiles. It's a small moment, but it softens the atmosphere further. As this part of the segment draws toward a transition, the disagreement hasn't been resolved, but it has been contextualized. Viewers watching live would likely feel that they've witnessed a real exchange of ideas, rather than a staged confrontation. The tension, while present, feels purposeful and controlled, setting up the conversation to continue evolving rather than abruptly ending. As the discussion continues, there's a noticeable shift in how the conversation is framed. The intensity hasn't disappeared, but it has matured into something more analytical. The hosts seem intent on unpacking the disagreement rather than escalating it, and Tom Cruise appears equally focused on clarifying his position rather than defending it. The studio atmosphere reflects this change, with the audience quieter now, listening closely instead of reacting instinctively. One of the co-hosts asks Cruise how he differentiates between personal conviction and public responsibility. It's a question that naturally grows out of what's already been said, and it invites elaboration rather than confrontation. Cruise takes a moment before responding, then explains that personal conviction is something he lives with every day, while public responsibility, in his view, begins and ends with honesty in his work. He says that audiences ultimately connect with authenticity, whether or not they agree with the person behind it. Whoopi responds by acknowledging that authenticity is essential, but she suggests that authenticity can include speaking openly about difficult topics. Her tone is steady, almost conversational, but the point is clear. She explains that viewers often look to public figures not for answers, but for reassurance that uncertainty is acceptable. Her phrasing is careful, grounded in the show's broader mission of reflecting diverse viewpoints. Cruz listens attentively, nodding slightly as she speaks. When he responds, he emphasizes that uncertainty is something everyone experiences, but he doesn't believe his role is to model it publicly. He says that he prefers to demonstrate resilience and focus, qualities he feels are more universally applicable. His voice remains calm, and there's no sense of irritation, only clarity. The audience reacts quietly, a few soft murmurs rippling through the studio. The camera briefly cuts to the other co-hosts, who appear thoughtful rather than reactive. It's clear that the conversation has moved beyond surface-level disagreement into something more philosophical, yet it still feels appropriate for a daytime setting. Whoopi then brings the discussion back to the show's audience, pointing out that many viewers appreciate hearing how successful individuals wrestle with complex issues. She frames this as an opportunity rather than an obligation, suggesting that sharing uncertainty can build connection. Her tone remains respectful, and she avoids framing the point as a challenge. Cruz responds by agreeing that connection matters, but he reiterates that connection can take many forms. He mentions that storytelling through film has always been his primary way of engaging with people. He explains that characters and narratives allow audiences to explore ideas without feeling directed or instructed. His delivery is smooth and measured, and he maintains steady eye contact with Whoopi as he speaks. The exchange draws a brief round of applause from the audience, suggesting appreciation for the thoughtful nature of the discussion. The energy in the room feels focused, with no one rushing to fill silences or redirect prematurely. The hosts allow the conversation to unfold naturally, trusting that viewers are following along. Another co-host asks whether Cruz ever feels pressure from fans or the industry to speak more openly on certain topics. Cruz answers honestly, saying that pressure exists, but it's something he's learned to manage over time. He explains that early in his career, external expectations were harder to navigate, but experience has taught him the importance of staying grounded. His tone remains reflective, and he speaks without defensiveness. Whoopi responds by noting that growth often involves reevaluating how one engages with the public. She says that her own approach has evolved over the years, shaped by feedback and changing cultural expectations. Her comment adds a personal dimension to the conversation, signaling that the discussion isn't just theoretical. Cruz acknowledges her point, expressing respect for her openness. He notes that different paths can lead to the same goal of staying true to oneself. His response feels conciliatory without being concessional. The disagreement remains, but it's now framed as a difference in approach rather than principle. The audience responds with light applause, and the co-hosts appear more at ease. The earlier tension has transformed into a calm exchange of perspectives, one that feels genuine and unscripted. The pacing slows slightly, giving each comment room to land. Whoopi then asks a more direct question, wondering whether Cruz believes public conversations can ever be truly productive. It's a thoughtful inquiry, not an accusation, and it invites reflection. Cruz pauses briefly before answering, then says that productivity depends on intention. He explains that when conversations aim to understand rather than persuade, they can be valuable, even if they don't reach consensus. This response seems to resonate with the audience, prompting a modest but sustained round of applause. Whoopi nods, acknowledging the point, and agrees that intention matters. She adds that shows like theirs strive to create space for understanding, even when disagreements persist. As the segment progresses, the discussion begins to feel more collaborative. The hosts build on each other's comments rather than pushing against them. Cruz remains composed, speaking thoughtfully and listening carefully. Whoopi continues to engage, her tone firm but open. The conversation then shifts slightly toward the role of media itself. One co-host asks how live television affects the way discussions unfold. Cruz responds that live settings add pressure, but also authenticity. He says that knowing there's no opportunity to edit forces everyone to be more present and deliberate. Whoopi agrees, noting that live television reveals how people truly think in the moment. She suggests that this is both a challenge and a strength. Her comment feels like a bridge between their perspectives, acknowledging the value of openness while respecting boundaries. The audience remains attentive, and the studio atmosphere feels steady and engaged. By this point, viewers watching at home would likely sense that the disagreement has reached a deeper level of understanding. It hasn't disappeared, but it has evolved into a respectful dialogue that reflects the complexity of the issue. As the segment continues into its later minutes, There's a clear sense that everyone at the table is aware of the time, but no one seems eager to rush the conversation to a conclusion. The discussion has taken on a reflective quality, the kind that feels less about making a point and more about explaining a perspective fully. Tom Cruise remains composed, sitting upright, hands relaxed, his tone consistent and measured. Whoopi Goldberg mirrors that steadiness, her delivery calm, her expressions thoughtful. One of the co-hosts brings up how viewers often interpret moments like this, noting that disagreements on the show are frequently remembered not for who won, but for how the conversation was handled. It's a subtle acknowledgement of what's happening in real time. Cruise responds by agreeing, saying that how people communicate during disagreement often leaves a stronger impression than the disagreement itself. He emphasizes that respect doesn't require agreement, a point that seems to resonate around the table. Whoopi responds by expanding on that idea, pointing out that respectful disagreement is something audiences rarely see modeled in public spaces anymore. Her tone remains steady, but there's a slight emphasis in her words, suggesting that this is something she values deeply. She gestures lightly, explaining that the show aims to demonstrate how differing viewpoints can coexist without turning personal. Cruise nods, acknowledging her point. He adds that part of holding one's ground is doing so without dismissing others. He explains that for him, staying calm is intentional, not calculated. His voice remains even, and his posture unchanged, reinforcing the sense that he is comfortable with the discussion as it stands. The studio audience reacts with a brief round of applause, not loud or exuberant, but affirming. The camera cuts to a wide shot of the table, capturing the collective focus of the hosts. The atmosphere feels grounded, as though the conversation has settled into a shared understanding of purpose, even if perspectives differ. Whoopi then circles back to an earlier point, asking Cruise whether he ever worries that his refusal to engage deeply on certain topics could be seen as avoidance. Her question is carefully phrased, free of accusation. Cruise takes a moment before responding, then says that he understands why some might see it that way. He explains that from the outside, boundaries can look like distance, but from the inside, they feel like clarity. He continues by saying that everyone chooses where to draw their lines, and that his choices are shaped by long-term experience rather than short-term comfort. His explanation is calm, deliberate, and grounded in personal reflection rather than defensiveness. Whoopi listens closely, then responds that clarity is important, but she also believes transparency can take many forms. She notes that explaining one's boundaries, as Cruise is doing now, can itself be a form of engagement. Her tone softens slightly, and she offers a small nod of acknowledgement. The audience responds with a few murmurs of agreement and scattered applause. The exchange feels like a moment of alignment, even if it doesn't erase their differences. The co-hosts appear to sense this shift and allow the conversation to continue without interruption. Another co-host brings up the role of audience expectations, asking whether public figures feel obligated to meet them. Cruise answers that expectations are unavoidable, but meeting all of them is impossible. He says that trying to do so can dilute authenticity. His delivery remains calm, and he speaks as if offering advice rather than defending himself. Whoopi adds that audience expectations can be heavy, especially in a live format. She explains that viewers often project their own experiences onto guests, hoping to see them reflected. Her comment adds nuance, acknowledging both sides of the dynamic. Cruise agrees, noting that projection is part of human nature. He says that recognizing this helps him remain steady during conversations like this one. His tone remains reflective, and he maintains eye contact with the hosts as he speaks. The studio remains quiet, attentive. There's no sense of impatience, only focus. The pacing slows slightly, allowing each thought to land. It's the kind of moment that feels distinctly live, where silence is not rushed but respected. Whoopi then offers a concluding thought for her side of the discussion, saying that while she still believes in speaking openly, she respects intentional restraint when it's explained thoughtfully. Her words feel like a summary rather than a concession. Cruise responds by thanking her for the conversation, acknowledging that respectful disagreement is valuable. The audience reacts with a stronger round of applause, recognizing the tone of mutual respect. The co-hosts exchange brief glances, and one of them mentions that these kinds of conversations are why viewers tune in. The comment is brief but reinforces the moment's significance. As the segment approaches its end, the tension that once defined the exchange has transformed into something steadier and more constructive. The The disagreement remains part of the conversation, but it no longer feels unresolved or uncomfortable. Instead, it feels understood, setting the stage for how the show will transition and how viewers will reflect on what they've just watched. As the segment begins to wrap up, there's a noticeable shift in energy at the table. The conversation doesn't end abruptly, but it naturally winds down, as live television often does when producers signal that time is nearly up. One of the co-hosts gently steers the discussion toward closing thoughts, thanking Tom Cruise for engaging openly with the panel. The tone is warm, and it reflects the sense that, despite the disagreement, the exchange remained respectful and meaningful. Cruise responds by expressing appreciation for the opportunity to talk through different perspectives. He says that conversations like this, even when they involve disagreement, are important because they allow people to listen more closely. His voice remains calm, and his posture relaxed, reinforcing the sense that he feels comfortable with how the discussion unfolded. Whoopi then offers her own closing remarks, addressing Cruise directly. She acknowledges that while they don't see everything the same way, she respects his willingness to explain his boundaries rather than avoid the conversation altogether. Her tone is sincere, and she adds that respectful dialogue is what keeps discussions productive, especially on live television. The studio audience reacts with sustained applause, louder and longer than earlier in the segment. It's the kind of response that feels less about taking sides and more about appreciating the tone of the exchange. The camera briefly cuts to the audience, capturing nods and attentive expressions, before returning to the table. As the show transitions to the next segment, the hosts exchange brief comments, lightening the mood slightly. There's a sense of relief mixed with reflection, as if everyone recognizes they've just navigated a delicate topic successfully. Cruise offers a final smile and a nod to the panel, signaling closure. After the episode airs, the conversation continues beyond the studio. Viewers at home begin sharing their reactions almost immediately. On social media, clips of the exchange circulate, with many people commenting on the calm, measured way the disagreement was handled. Some viewers praise Cruise for holding his ground without becoming defensive, noting that his composure stood out. Others side with Whoopi, appreciating her insistence on open discussion and her role in representing audience curiosity. Media commentary reflects a similar split, with headlines focusing not on controversy, but on the tone of the exchange. Analysts point out that the segment exemplified how disagreement can be handled thoughtfully on daytime television. Several commentators note that neither side appeared to win, but that the conversation itself was the takeaway. In follow-up discussions on later episodes of the show, the hosts briefly reference the exchange, framing it as an example of the show's commitment to open dialogue. Whoopi reiterates that disagreement doesn't have to be uncomfortable to be meaningful, and that moments like this encourage viewers to think critically rather than react emotionally. Cruise's representatives later acknowledged the appearance in a brief statement, emphasizing his respect for the hosts and the value of thoughtful conversation. The statement avoids revisiting specific points, instead focusing on the positive tone of the discussion. This further reinforces the impression that the exchange, while tense at moments, was handled professionally on all sides. Among viewers, the segment continues to spark conversation. Some people express appreciation for seeing a public figure calmly explain their perspective without resorting to talking points. Others say the discussion made them reflect on their own expectations of celebrities and public accountability. The range of reactions highlights the very dynamic the segment explored, differing viewpoints coexisting without needing resolution. By the end of the week, the moment has settled into the broader cycle of daytime television discussion. It's remembered not as a confrontation, but as a thoughtful exchange that stayed true to the tone of the show. The disagreement between Tom Cruise and Whoopi Goldberg remains part of the narrative, but it's framed by mutual respect and careful listening. As viewers reflect on what they watched, the lasting impression is one of balance. The segment demonstrated how live television can handle sensitive topics without escalating them, and how holding one's ground doesn't require raising one's voice. If you watched the conversation unfold, you likely felt as though you were witnessing a genuine moment rather than a manufactured one. Now we want to hear from you. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.